Have you ever wondered what it would be like to survive a winter so brutal that it could literally freeze your breath before it left your mouth? Well, imagine being a Viking in medieval Scandinavia, where winter wasn't just cold, it was a 6-month death sentence that most people today couldn't survive for even a single week. Most people think they understand how harsh Viking winters were. They picture some snow, maybe temperatures dropping below freezing, and Vikings huddled around fires telling stories. But the reality was so much more terrifying than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. These weren't just cold winters. They were apocalyptic frozen wastelands that transformed the entire landscape into a death trap where a single mistake could mean you'd never see spring again. In this video, I'm going to reveal the 7 most horrifying aspects of Viking winters that historians rarely talk about. We're going to explore how these legendary warriors survived temperatures that would kill modern humans in hours, why their food storage methods were literally a matter of life and death, and the shocking psychological toll that months of darkness took on entire communities. But first, let me give you some context that will completely change how you think about winter survival. My name is here to take you on a journey back to a time when winter meant something completely different than it does today. I've spent years researching medieval climate data, archaeological evidence, and historical accounts to uncover the truth about what Viking winters were really like. What I discovered was so much worse than I ever imagined, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why these people were forced to become some of the most resourceful and ruthless survivors in human history. But before we dive into the nightmare that was a Viking winter, I need to set the stage with something that will blow your mind. The period we're talking about, roughly from 800 to 1200 CE, occurred during what climate scientists call the medieval warm period. That's right. These were actually some of the warmest centuries in recent history. So if you think Viking winters were brutal during the warm period, just wait until you hear what happened when the climate started cooling down. Now, most people assume that because Vikings were tough warriors, they must have been naturally adapted to cold weather. But here's the thing that changes everything. Vikings weren't superhuman. They were regular people, just like you and me, facing environmental conditions that would challenge even our most advanced modern survival technology. The difference was that they had no choice but to adapt or die, and the methods they developed were often more desperate than heroic. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical Viking settlement looked like as winter approached. Imagine a small cluster of wooden longhouses, maybe housing 50 to 100 people total, sitting on the edge of a fjord or nestled in a valley. These weren't the massive stone fortresses you see in movies. They were essentially large wooden sheds with dirt floors, minimal insulation, and roofs that leaked. Now, imagine that in just a few weeks, this entire area would be buried under several feet of snow, with temperatures dropping to levels that would make your modern winter thermostat weep. The first thing you need to understand about Viking winters is that they lasted far longer than anything we experience today. We're not talking about a few cold months from December to February. Viking winter could stretch from October all the way through April, with the worst conditions lasting for 4 solid months, where the sun might not rise above the horizon for weeks at a time. In the northernmost Viking settlements, they experienced what's called polar night, where the sun doesn't rise at all for months. But the length of winter was just the beginning of their problems. The temperatures were beyond anything most modern people can comprehend. While we complain when it drops below 0 Fahrenheit, Viking winters regularly saw temperatures plummet to -30, -40, or even -50 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes, metal becomes brittle enough to shatter, and even breathing becomes painful as the moisture in your lungs begins to freeze. Now, you might be thinking, surely they just stayed inside their warm houses until spring came, right? Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Viking longhouses weren't warm. They were death traps that required constant maintenance just to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The central fire pit that provided heat also filled the house with smoke, since proper chimneys weren't invented yet. Vikings had to choose between freezing to death or slowly suffocating on toxic fumes. The smoke problem was so severe that Viking houses had holes in the roof to let the smoke escape, but this also let in snow, rain, and freezing air. Imagine trying to sleep in a house where smoke is burning your eyes and lungs, snow is falling through the roof onto your bed, and the temperature inside is barely above freezing, even with a fire burning constantly. This was their reality for months at a time. But the real nightmare wasn't just the cold or the smoke. It was the complete isolation that winter brought. Once the snow started falling and the fjords began to freeze, Viking communities became completely cut off from the outside world. There were no roads to plough, no supply chains to maintain, and no way to get help if something went wrong. Each settlement was entirely on its own, with whatever food, fuel, and supplies they had managed to stockpile before winter arrived. This isolation created a pressure cooker effect that most people don't think about. Imagine being trapped in a small, smoky, freezing building with the same 50 people for 6 months straight. There's no privacy, no escape, and no way to leave even if tensions rise. Arguments that might normally blow over in a day could escalate into deadly feuds when people are trapped together for months. The psychological stress was so intense that many Viking sagas describe winter as a time when madness and violence were common. The food situation was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. Vikings didn't have refrigeration, canning, or any of the food preservation methods we take for granted today. They had to rely on smoking, salting, and drying to preserve enough food to last through the winter. But here's the catch: these preservation methods weren't foolproof. If the weather was too humid, meat would rot before it could be properly dried. If it was too dry, the food would become inedible. If raiders attacked and destroyed their food stores, or if they miscalculated how much food they needed, entire communities could face starvation. The archaeological evidence shows us that many Viking settlements experienced what historians call the hunger gap, a period in late winter or early spring when the previous year's food stores were running dangerously low, but new food sources weren't available yet. During these times, Vikings were forced to eat things that we would consider inedible today: tree bark, leather, and even the bones of animals they had already consumed. But even if they had enough food, the winter diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. For months, Vikings survived primarily on salted fish, dried meat, and whatever grains they could store. Fresh vegetables were impossible to preserve, so scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases were common. The lack of fresh food meant that their immune systems were weakened just when they needed them most, making them vulnerable to diseases that could spread rapidly through their crowded, poorly ventilated longhouses. The water situation was equally challenging. Rivers and wells would freeze solid, making it impossible to access fresh water for months at a time. Vikings had to melt snow and ice for all their water needs, which required precious fuel that they also needed for heat and cooking. This created a constant trade-off between staying warm and staying hydrated. Some settlements were forced to ration water, drinking barely enough to survive in order to conserve fuel for heating. Now, let's talk about clothing and how inadequate it really was. We often picture Vikings wearing thick fur coats and warm boots, but the reality was far different. Most Vikings were farmers or craftsmen, not wealthy warriors, and they couldn't afford elaborate winter gear. The average Viking wore layers of wool clothing, which provided some insulation when dry but became dangerously cold when wet. And in the humid, smoky environment of a longhouse, everything was constantly damp. Their footwear was particularly problematic. Viking boots were made of leather, which provided little insulation and became stiff and uncomfortable in extreme cold. Frostbite was common, and many Vikings suffered permanent damage to their feet and hands from repeated exposure to freezing temperatures. The archaeological record shows us skeletons with clear signs of frostbite damage, indicating that this was a widespread problem. The psychological toll of these conditions cannot be overstated. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder shows us how devastating prolonged darkness can be for human mental health. Now, imagine experiencing this in a time before electric lights, when the only illumination came from flickering fires and oil lamps. The combination of darkness, cold, hunger, and isolation created a perfect storm for depression and anxiety. Viking sagas and historical accounts describe winter as a time when supernatural beliefs became more intense. People reported seeing ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural phenomena during the darkest months. While we might dismiss these as folklore, they likely reflect the very real psychological stress that Vikings experienced during winter. Hallucinations, paranoia, and other mental health symptoms would have been common in communities suffering from malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and extreme stress. The social structure of Viking communities also changed dramatically during winter. The normal activities of farming, trading, and raiding were impossible, so communities had to find new ways to occupy their time and maintain social order. Storytelling became crucial not just for entertainment, but for preserving important cultural knowledge and maintaining group cohesion. The long winter nights were when the great Viking sagas were told and retold, passing down everything from navigation techniques to legal traditions. But these storytelling sessions weren't just pleasant gatherings around a fire. They were often the only thing standing between a community and complete social breakdown. In the cramped, stressful conditions of a winter longhouse, entertainment and social rituals became matters of survival, communities that couldn't maintain morale and social order. During the winter months, often didn't survive to see spring. The health challenges went far beyond what we've already discussed. The combination of poor nutrition, crowded living conditions, and compromised immune systems made Viking communities vulnerable to epidemic diseases during winter. A single sick person could infect an entire settlement. And with no medical knowledge or antibiotics, diseases that we consider minor today could wipe out whole families. Childbirth during winter was particularly dangerous. Women who gave birth in the coldest months faced enormous risks, not just from the birth itself, but from the challenge of keeping a newborn alive in such harsh conditions. Infant mortality rates were already high in Viking times, but winter births had an even lower survival rate. The decision of when to have children was literally a matter of life and death, with most families trying to time births for the warmer months. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Viking winters was their unpredictability. While Vikings could prepare for a typical winter, they had no way to predict when an unusually harsh winter would arrive. Climate records show that the medieval period experienced significant weather variability, with some winters being far more severe than others. A winter that was just 20% colder or longer than usual could mean the difference between survival and death for an entire community. The archaeological evidence shows us settlements that were simply abandoned during particularly harsh winters, their inhabitants either dying or fleeing to other locations. These ghost towns, buried under centuries of soil and vegetation, tell the story of communities that couldn't survive when winter exceeded their ability to cope. The evidence of these failed settlements reveals something that modern survival experts are only beginning to understand. The margin for error in Viking winter survival was essentially zero. One broken storage container, one house fire, one key person falling ill at the wrong time, and an entire community could spiral into a death trap from which there was no escape. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of Viking winter survival: the absolute dependence on community cooperation. In our modern world, we're used to individual solutions to problems. Your heating breaks down, you call a repair service. You run out of food, you go to the store. But for Vikings, survival was entirely communal. Every person in the settlement had to contribute perfectly to the collective survival effort, or everyone died together. This created a social pressure that's almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Imagine knowing that if you made a mistake, got sick, or couldn't pull your weight, you weren't just risking your own life, you were potentially dooming 50 other people, including children and elderly relatives. The psychological weight of this responsibility drove many Vikings to extreme measures that we would consider barbaric today. Historical accounts describe instances where communities made the horrifying decision to abandon their weakest members when resources became critically low. Elderly people who couldn't contribute to winter survival were sometimes left outside to freeze, not out of cruelty, but because keeping them alive meant everyone else would starve. These weren't decisions made by monsters, but by desperate people facing impossible choices that no human being should ever have to make. The concept of individual rights or personal space simply didn't exist during Viking winters. Privacy was a luxury that could get you killed. Every resource, every decision, every action had to be coordinated with the survival of the group in mind. People slept in communal beds not for warmth and companionship, but because individual sleeping arrangements would have wasted precious heat and space. Personal belongings were shared freely, because hoarding supplies could doom the entire community. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The social hierarchy that existed during the warmer months often completely broke down during winter. The chieftain, who commanded respect during raiding season, might find his authority challenged by whoever was best at managing winter survival. Women often gained power during winter because they typically managed food storage and distribution, making them literally the gatekeepers between life and death. Children were valued not for their potential, but for their immediate ability to contribute to survival tasks. This social upheaval created internal conflicts that were just as dangerous as the external threats of cold and starvation. Viking sagas are full of stories about winter feuds that erupted when normal social structures collapsed under survival pressure. These weren't just arguments. They were life or death struggles for resources and control that could tear apart communities that had lived together peacefully for generations. The sleep patterns of Vikings during winter were completely different from anything we experience today. With only a few hours of dim daylight, Vikings couldn't maintain normal circadian rhythms. They developed what historians call segmented sleep, sleeping in multiple shorter periods throughout the day and night, whenever fuel could be spared for heat and whenever their bodies could no longer function from exhaustion. This disrupted sleep schedule had devastating effects on their physical and mental health. Modern sleep research shows us that irregular sleep patterns can cause everything from weakened immune systems to severe depression. For Vikings, who were already dealing with malnutrition and extreme stress, these sleep disruptions compounded their health problems exponentially. Many historical accounts describe Vikings becoming increasingly irrational and violent as winter progressed, likely due in part to chronic sleep deprivation. The work required just to stay alive during winter was backbreaking and never-ending. Vikings had to constantly maintain their fires, which meant someone had to be awake and tending the flames every few hours throughout the night. They had to regularly clear snow from their roofs to prevent collapse, venture outside in deadly conditions to gather whatever fuel they could find, and constantly repair their shelters as the extreme weather damaged them. But perhaps the most exhausting task was the constant battle against moisture and mold. The combination of cooking, breathing, and melting snow for water created massive humidity inside the longhouses. This moisture would freeze on the walls and ceiling, creating ice that would melt during the day and refreeze at night. The constant cycle of freezing and thawing created structural damage that had to be repaired constantly, and the humidity created perfect conditions for mold and fungal growth that could contaminate their food supplies. The tools and weapons that Vikings depended on became nearly useless in extreme cold. Metal tools would become brittle and break at the worst possible moments. Wooden handles would crack and split. Leather would freeze solid and become impossible to work with. Vikings had to constantly maintain and repair their essential tools, but the materials they needed for repairs were often unavailable during winter. A broken axe or knife could mean the difference between life and death. But fixing it might require resources they couldn't spare. The animals that Vikings depended on for food, labor, and materials suffered just as much as the humans. Livestock had to be brought inside during the worst weather, which meant sharing the already cramped living space with cattle, pigs, and chickens. These animals produced waste that had to be managed, consumed precious food resources, and added to the humidity and air quality problems inside the longhouses. But losing livestock was often worse than the inconvenience of housing them. A cow or pig represented not just food, but also milk, leather, bone tools, and other essential materials that couldn't be replaced until spring. Vikings would go to extraordinary lengths to keep their animals alive, sometimes even sharing their own food with livestock when feed ran low. The death of a key animal could trigger a cascade of problems that would doom the entire community. The most terrifying aspect of Viking winter survival was the complete lack of backup plans. In our modern world, we have emergency services, hospitals, supply chains, and communication networks that can help us when things go wrong. Vikings had none of these safety nets. When their primary survival strategy failed, there was no plan B. Communities that found themselves in crisis during winter had to improvise solutions using whatever materials they had on hand, and these desperate measures often led to their doom. Archaeological evidence shows us settlements where Vikings attempted increasingly desperate survival strategies as their situations became hopeless. We find evidence of people burning furniture, tools, and even structural elements of their houses for fuel. We see signs that they ate leather, bones, and anything else that might provide nutrition. Some sites show evidence that communities resorted to cannibalism when all other food sources were exhausted. These archaeological discoveries reveal the final, most horrifying truth about Viking winters. They weren't just cold and difficult. They were elimination events that regularly wiped out entire communities. The Vikings we know from history and legend were the survivors, the ones who made it through these impossible conditions. For every successful Viking settlement, there were probably dozens that simply vanished during particularly harsh winters, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and bones to tell their story. The psychological adaptation required to survive these conditions fundamentally changed how Vikings viewed life and death. They developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted death as a constant companion, not something that happened to other people or in old age, but something that could come for anyone at any moment. This acceptance of mortality influenced everything from their religious beliefs to their approach to warfare and exploration. But this fatalism also gave them a kind of fearlessness that modern people struggle to understand. When you've survived multiple winters where death was a daily possibility, facing enemy warriors in battle probably seemed almost mundane by comparison. The legendary Viking courage that we read about in sagas wasn't just cultural bravado. It was the practical result of living through experiences that would break most modern people psychologically. The children who survived Viking winters grew up with a completely different relationship to risk, hardship, and survival than anything we can imagine today. They learned from infancy that comfort and safety were temporary luxuries, that survival required constant vigilance and preparation, and that the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions and perfect execution of survival skills. These children became the adults who would eventually launch the Viking Age, exploring and conquering territories from Greenland to Constantinople. Their willingness to sail into unknown waters, establish settlements in hostile environments, and take enormous risks in pursuit of resources and opportunities wasn't just cultural ambition. It was the practical result of growing up in conditions where taking calculated risks was the only way to survive. The ripple effects of Viking winter survival extended far beyond individual communities. The constant threat of winter starvation drove Vikings to develop increasingly sophisticated raiding and trading networks. They couldn't afford to be self-sufficient, because self-sufficiency in such a harsh environment was impossible. They needed to acquire resources from other regions, which meant they had to become some of the most skilled navigators, traders, and warriors in the medieval world. This creates a fascinating paradox. The very conditions that made Viking settlements barely habitable also forced Vikings to become some of the most adventurous and capable people in human history. Their winter survival skills translated directly into the abilities that allowed them to establish settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even briefly in North America. The same resourcefulness that kept them alive through brutal winters also enabled them to adapt to completely new environments thousands of miles from home. The navigation skills that Vikings developed partly out of winter necessity became legendary. But what most people don't realize is that these skills were literally forged in the crucible of life or death decision-making. When your community's survival depends on knowing exactly when the last trading voyage of the season needs to depart before the fjords freeze over, you don't get second chances. Viking navigators had to read weather patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes with an accuracy that would impress modern meteorologists, because a mistake in timing could mean being trapped away from home when winter arrived. Or worse, being caught at sea when the storms hit. The seasonal trading expeditions that Vikings are famous for weren't just economic opportunities, they were desperate survival missions. Communities would send out their best warriors and traders on voyages that lasted months, knowing that these men might not return, but also knowing that without the resources they brought back, everyone would die during the winter. These weren't casual trading trips where you could come back empty-handed and try again next year. The pressure to succeed was absolute, which explains why Vikings were willing to travel such enormous distances and take such incredible risks to acquire the goods they needed. But here's something that will completely change how you think about Viking exploration. Many of their most famous voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and North America weren't driven by wanderlust or adventure. They were essentially desperate attempts to escape the impossible survival conditions of Scandinavian winters. When your homeland regularly produces winters that kill significant portions of the population, suddenly sailing into unknown waters to establish new settlements doesn't seem nearly as crazy. It was a calculated risk where the potential rewards outweighed the certainty of eventual death if they stayed put. The settlement of Iceland around 870 CE is a perfect example of this winter-driven expansion. The people who made this journey weren't seeking adventure. They were fleeing a homeland where population growth had made winter survival increasingly difficult. Iceland offered the promise of new agricultural land, untapped resources, and most importantly, the possibility of establishing communities that weren't already operating at the razor's edge of survival capacity. But what they found in Iceland was winters that were even more brutal than what they had left behind in Norway. The early Icelandic settlers faced winter conditions that make even the Scandinavian winters we've been discussing look manageable. Iceland's volcanic activity created unpredictable weather patterns with sudden temperature drops that could kill unprepared travelers in hours. The island's position in the North Atlantic meant that storms could arrive with little warning, bringing winds that could literally freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The settlers had to develop entirely new survival strategies, and many of the early settlements simply vanished, their inhabitants presumably dying during particularly harsh winters. What makes the Icelandic expansion even more remarkable is that these settlers were essentially conducting a massive survival experiment with no backup plan. They couldn't just return to Norway if things went wrong because they had burned their bridges, selling everything they owned to fund the journey. They had to make Iceland work or die trying. And the archaeological evidence shows us that many of them did exactly that. Failed settlements dot the Icelandic landscape, silent testimony to communities that couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive their first few winters. The successful Icelandic settlements developed winter survival strategies that were even more extreme than anything we've discussed so far. They learned to use Iceland's geothermal features for heating, essentially building their communities around natural hot springs that could provide warmth even in the depths of winter. But this created a new set of problems, because these geothermal areas were limited and often located in places that were otherwise unsuitable for settlement. Vikings had to choose between access to natural heating and access to good farmland, fresh water, or defensive positions. The Icelandic Vikings also developed new methods of food preservation that took advantage of Iceland's unique climate. They learned to use the constant wind and cold to create natural refrigeration systems that could preserve food for longer periods than traditional smoking or salting methods. But these techniques required perfect timing and precise environmental conditions. A change in wind patterns or an unexpected warm spell could destroy months of carefully preserved food, leaving entire communities facing starvation. The psychological pressure of living in these experimental settlements was enormous. Every decision about resource allocation, every choice about where to build or what to plant, every judgment about when to slaughter livestock or when to preserve food could determine whether the community survived its next winter. The margin for error was even smaller than it had been in Scandinavia, because they didn't have generations of accumulated knowledge about local conditions to guide them. This constant pressure created a culture of innovation that was unlike anything else in the medieval world. Icelandic Vikings couldn't rely on traditional methods because they were operating in an environment where traditional methods often didn't work. They had to constantly experiment, adapt, and improvise, developing new techniques for everything from house construction to food storage to animal husbandry. The successful innovations spread rapidly through the small Icelandic population, while the failures were quickly abandoned, often along with the communities that had tried them. The social structures that emerged in these experimental settlements were also unique. The traditional Viking hierarchy based on military prowess and wealth became less important than practical survival skills. A person who could predict weather patterns, manage food stores efficiently, or develop new building techniques might gain more respect and influence than a traditional warrior. This created a more fluid social structure, where innovation and practical intelligence were highly valued. But this constant innovation came at a terrible cost. The communities that succeeded in Iceland were the ones that could adapt quickly enough to survive their mistakes. The ones that couldn't adapt fast enough simply disappeared, taking their knowledge and innovations with them. This created a brutal evolutionary pressure where only the most adaptable and resourceful communities survived. But it also meant that much of the knowledge gained through experimentation was lost when communities failed. The religious and cultural implications of these extreme survival conditions were profound. Vikings had always believed in a cosmos where conflict and struggle were fundamental aspects of existence. But the experience of settling new territories in even harsher conditions reinforced these beliefs in ways that shaped their entire worldview. The concept of Ragnarok, the end of the world through a terrible winter, wasn't just mythology to people who had seen entire communities disappear during harsh winters. It was a very real possibility that they lived with every day. The sagas and stories that emerged from these settlement experiences reflect this heightened awareness of mortality and the fragility of human civilization. The heroes of Icelandic literature aren't just brave warriors, they're people who can make the impossible decisions required to keep communities alive through existential crises. These stories served as both entertainment and practical instruction, preserving knowledge about survival techniques while also providing psychological preparation for the kinds of extreme situations that settlers might face. The expansion into Greenland around 985 CE represents perhaps the most extreme example of Viking winter survival challenges. Eric the Red, who led the Greenland settlement, wasn't just seeking new territory, he was essentially leading a group of people into what amounted to a frozen wilderness where the margin for survival error was even smaller than it had been in Iceland. The name Greenland itself was possibly an early example of what we might call false advertising, designed to attract settlers to a place that was even more challenging than what they were leaving behind. The Greenland settlements pushed Viking winter survival techniques to their absolute limits. The growing season was so short that traditional agriculture was barely possible. The communities had to rely almost entirely on hunting, fishing, and trading with the Inuit populations, who had already developed specialized techniques for surviving in Arctic conditions. But this created a dependency that made the settlements extremely vulnerable to any disruption in their food sources or trading relationships. The archaeological evidence from Greenland shows us settlements that were constantly on the edge of survival failure. We find evidence of people eating increasingly marginal foods as conditions deteriorated, including seals, whales, and other marine animals that required specialized hunting techniques. The settlements had to develop new tools, new hunting methods, and new food preservation techniques just to survive their first few winters. But they also had to do all of this while maintaining the livestock and agricultural practices that were essential to their cultural identity as Vikings. The social pressure in these extreme settlements was unlike anything we've discussed so far. In Greenland, there wasn't just the pressure of community survival, there was also the pressure of maintaining contact with the outside world. The settlements were so isolated that they could only receive supplies and news from Europe once or twice a year, during the brief summer months when navigation was possible. This meant that any crisis that developed during winter couldn't be resolved until the following summer, if at all. The psychological toll of this isolation was enormous. People in the Greenland settlements lived with the constant awareness that help was literally months away, and that any mistake or misfortune could doom them before rescue was even possible. This created a kind of paranoia and hypervigilance that's evident in the archaeological record, where we see evidence of increasingly elaborate food storage systems, defensive preparations, and backup plans that suggest people were constantly preparing for the worst-case scenario. The climate data from the Greenland ice cores tells us that these settlements were established during a relatively warm period, but they had to survive through a gradual cooling trend that made conditions increasingly difficult over time. What had been challenging but manageable winters in the early years of settlement became increasingly impossible as the climate cooled. The settlements had to constantly adapt their survival strategies to deal with longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and more unpredictable weather patterns. The final collapse of the Greenland settlements around 1450 CE represents one of the most dramatic examples of winter survival failure in human history. These weren't primitive people who lacked survival skills. They were the descendants of some of the most successful Arctic survivors in the world. They had developed sophisticated techniques for living in extreme conditions. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge about local conditions, and they had proven their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But even with all of these advantages, they ultimately couldn't survive the combination of climate change, resource depletion, and social isolation that characterized the later medieval period. The lessons from the Greenland collapse are sobering for anyone interested in extreme survival. These communities failed not because they lacked individual survival skills, but because they couldn't maintain the complex social and economic systems that extreme survival requires. When the trading networks that brought them essential supplies from Europe became unreliable, when the climate cooled beyond their ability to adapt, when their population dropped below the critical mass needed to maintain specialized knowledge and skills, the entire system collapsed with shocking speed. The archaeological evidence suggests that the final years of the Greenland settlements were characterized by increasingly desperate survival measures. We find evidence of people eating their livestock breeding stock, burning furniture and buildings for fuel, and abandoning the agricultural practices that had sustained them for centuries. The last inhabitants appear to have been trying to survive by hunting and gathering alone, essentially reverting to survival strategies that might have worked for small nomadic groups, but couldn't sustain permanent settlements. But here's the most chilling aspect of the Greenland collapse. It happened gradually, over several generations, which means that people living through it probably didn't realize how dire their situation had become until it was too late to reverse course. Each winter was just a little bit harder than the last, each summer just a little bit shorter, each year just a little bit more difficult to get through. The communities adapted to each incremental change, but they couldn't adapt fast enough to survive the cumulative effect of all these changes together. This gradual collapse pattern appears to have been common in many Viking settlements that failed during winter crises. Archaeological evidence from failed settlements across Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland shows similar patterns of incremental adaptation, followed by sudden collapse. Communities would successfully adapt to increasingly difficult conditions for years or even decades, but then reach a tipping point where their survival systems could no longer cope with the accumulated stress. The implications of this pattern are terrifying when you really think about it. It means that even successful Viking communities were constantly walking a tightrope between survival and extinction, and that the difference between a thriving settlement and a dead one could be as small as a single harsh winter or one key resource becoming unavailable. The Vikings who survived to become the legendary figures we know from history were the ones who managed to stay on the right side of this survival equation, but they were always just one mistake away from joining the anonymous communities that didn't make it. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight about Viking winter survival. It wasn't just about individual toughness or cultural resilience. It was about maintaining incredibly complex systems of resource management, social cooperation, and risk assessment that required perfect execution year after year. The Vikings who succeeded weren't necessarily stronger or braver than those who failed. They were the ones who managed to maintain these complex survival systems long enough to establish sustainable communities. The knowledge systems that successful Viking communities developed were incredibly sophisticated, encompassing everything from detailed weather prediction to complex resource allocation algorithms that would impress modern operations researchers. But this knowledge was entirely oral, passed down through generations of storytellers and preserved in the collective memory of communities. When communities failed, their knowledge died with them, which meant that each new settlement had to rediscover survival techniques that might have been perfected elsewhere but were lost when previous communities collapsed. This creates a fascinating paradox in Viking history. The very conditions that made their survival so impressive also made it extremely difficult to learn from their experiences. The communities that developed the most effective survival techniques were often the ones that were most isolated and therefore least able to share their knowledge with other settlements. The techniques that worked in one location might not work in another, and the people who had perfected these techniques might not survive long enough to pass them on to the next generation. The archaeological record gives us glimpses of this lost knowledge in the form of artifacts and settlement patterns that suggest sophisticated survival techniques. But we can only guess at the specific methods that were used. We see evidence of food storage systems that could preserve supplies for years, heating systems that could warm large buildings efficiently, and construction techniques that could create structures capable of withstanding extreme weather. But the knowledge of how to build and maintain these systems died with the communities that created them. This lost knowledge represents one of the great tragedies of Viking winter survival. How many communities might have survived if they had access to the techniques developed by previous settlements? How many innovations were lost when communities failed? How much more successful might Viking expansion have been if they had been able to systematically preserve and share survival knowledge across their scattered settlements? The answer to these questions is unknowable, but the implications are staggering. The Viking expansion that we know from history represents just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of human experimentation with extreme survival. For every successful settlement that left historical records, there were probably dozens of failed attempts that left only scattered artifacts and bones. The Vikings, we celebrate in our histories and legends, were the survivors of a massive, centuries-long experiment in human adaptability that claimed far more lives than it preserved. This perspective completely changes how we should think about Viking achievements. Their success in exploration, trade, and warfare wasn't just the result of cultural values or superior technology. It was the product of a brutal selection process that eliminated anyone who couldn't master the most demanding survival skills imaginable. The Vikings, who survived to become legendary figures, had been forged in conditions that would kill most modern people, and their achievements were built on the accumulated knowledge of countless communities that didn't survive to share their stories. Understanding this brutal selection process helps explain why Viking culture became so focused on concepts of honor, courage, and fate. These weren't just abstract philosophical ideas. They were practical psychological tools that helped people cope with the reality that death was always just one mistake away. When you've lived through winters where entire families could die from a single bad decision about food rationing, concepts like fate and honor become ways of making sense of a world where survival often seemed to depend more on luck than skill. The honor culture that Vikings are famous for was directly connected to their winter survival experiences. In a community where everyone's life depended on everyone else's competence and commitment, reputation became literally a matter of life and death. A person who was known to be unreliable, cowardly, or selfish wouldn't just be socially ostracized, they would be actively dangerous to community survival. The elaborate codes of honor that governed Viking society weren't just cultural traditions. They were survival mechanisms that helped communities identify and eliminate people who posed existential threats to the group. But this honor system also created its own problems during winter survival situations. The same cultural values that helped maintain community cohesion during good times could become deadly burdens when resources became scarce. A warrior who was culturally required to maintain his honor might refuse to perform tasks that he considered beneath his status, even when those tasks were essential for survival. A family that was expected to be generous and hospitable might continue sharing their food stores even when doing so meant they wouldn't have enough for their own survival. The tension between cultural values and survival necessity created some of the most psychologically devastating aspects of Viking winter experiences. People were forced to choose between maintaining their cultural identity and staying alive, and these choices often had no good answers. The archaeological evidence shows us settlements where people appear to have died rather than violate cultural taboos about food, social hierarchy, or family obligations. These weren't deaths from ignorance or lack of survival skills. They were deaths from the impossible psychological pressure of trying to maintain human dignity in inhuman conditions. The gender dynamics of Viking winter survival were particularly complex and often completely different from what we see in their summer activities. During the raiding and trading season, Viking society was heavily male-dominated, with men taking the lead in most economic and political activities. But during winter, when survival depended on managing food stores, maintaining households, and caring for children and elderly family members, women often became the most powerful people in the community. This seasonal shift in power created unique social tensions that don't exist in most other historical societies. Men who were accustomed to being leaders and decision-makers during the active season had to defer to women who had the knowledge and skills needed for winter survival. Women who might have had relatively little say in community decisions during the summer could find themselves making life or death choices for entire settlements during the winter months. These role reversals were necessary for survival, but they also created psychological stress for people who had to constantly readjust their social expectations based on the season. The children in these communities experienced childhood in ways that would be completely alien to modern people. Viking children didn't have the luxury of a protected, innocent childhood, where they could gradually learn about the world's dangers. They had to become contributing members of the survival effort from the moment they were old enough to perform simple tasks. A 5-year-old child might be responsible for maintaining the fire overnight, knowing that if they fell asleep and let the fire die, everyone in the house could freeze to death before morning. This early exposure to life or death responsibility created adults who were capable of making impossible decisions under extreme pressure, but it also created psychological trauma that we can only imagine. Children who grew up in these conditions never had the chance to develop the kind of optimistic, trusting worldview that we consider normal for healthy psychological development. They learned from infancy that the world was a dangerous place where mistakes had fatal consequences, and this knowledge shaped their entire approach to life. The educational system in Viking communities during winter was unlike anything we see in other historical societies. Children didn't learn abstract academic subjects. They learned practical skills that would keep them alive. But this education was incredibly sophisticated, encompassing everything from weather prediction to resource management to complex social negotiations. A Viking child who survived to adulthood had received an education in survival skills that would rival anything taught in modern military or wilderness survival programs. But this education came at a terrible cost. Children who couldn't master these skills quickly enough didn't get second chances. The community couldn't afford to support people who couldn't contribute to survival efforts, regardless of their age or circumstances. This created a brutal selection pressure where only the most capable and adaptable children survived to become adults. The Vikings we know from history were the products of this selection process, which explains their legendary competence, but also hints at the enormous human cost of their achievements. The religious and spiritual practices that sustained Viking communities during winter were far more complex and psychologically sophisticated than most people realize. The Norse mythology that we know from later sources wasn't just entertainment or abstract theology. It was a practical psychological framework that helped people cope with the reality of living in conditions where death was a constant possibility. The stories about gods struggling against impossible odds, heroes facing certain doom with courage, and the ultimate fate of the world ending in winter weren't just myths. They were psychological preparation for the kinds of experiences that Vikings faced every year. The concept of Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain where warriors who died in battle would feast and fight for eternity, takes on completely different meaning when you understand the reality of Viking winter survival. For people who spent months every year wondering if they would live to see spring, the idea of an afterlife where the struggles of existence were transformed into eternal celebration wasn't just comforting, it was psychologically essential. The promise that death in battle would lead to eternal feasting would have been particularly appealing to people who regularly face the possibility of slow death from starvation or freezing. But the religious practices that actually sustained communities during winter were often quite different from the dramatic mythology that we associate with Viking culture. The daily rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and community practices that helped people maintain psychological stability during the darkest months were often focused on more practical concerns like ensuring community cooperation, maintaining hope during periods of despair, and creating social bonds that could withstand the enormous stress of survival situations. The archaeological evidence shows us that Viking communities developed increasingly elaborate ritual practices around food storage, distribution, and consumption during winter months. These weren't just practical activities. They were sacred ceremonies that helped maintain social cohesion and psychological stability. The act of rationing food, for example, wasn't just a practical necessity, it was a ritual that reinforced community bonds and shared responsibility. People who participated in these rituals were psychologically prepared to make the sacrifices necessary for group survival. The storytelling traditions that we associate with Viking culture were also practical psychological tools for winter survival. The long, complex sagas that were recited during winter gatherings weren't just entertainment. They were ways of preserving essential knowledge, maintaining cultural identity, and providing psychological escape from the harsh realities of daily survival. But these stories also served as training exercises that helped people mentally rehearse the kinds of difficult decisions they might have to make in survival situations. The heroes of Viking sagas face many of the same impossible choices that real people encountered during winter survival crises. They have to choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to community, between maintaining honor and staying alive, between preserving cultural values and adapting to new circumstances. By mentally rehearsing these dilemmas through storytelling, Viking communities were preparing themselves psychologically for the kinds of decisions that might mean the difference between survival and death. The medical knowledge that Viking communities developed during their winter survival experiences was surprisingly sophisticated, but it was also closely guarded and difficult to preserve. Communities that developed effective treatments for cold-related injuries, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological disorders had significant survival advantages. But this knowledge was often lost when communities failed or when the people who possessed it died before they could pass it on to others. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking communities developed medical treatments that were remarkably effective given their limited resources. We find evidence of surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and psychological interventions that suggest a sophisticated understanding of human physiology and psychology. But we also find evidence of communities that lacked this knowledge and suffered devastating losses from medical problems that other settlements had learned to treat effectively. The inequality in medical knowledge between different communities created another layer of survival pressure that most people don't consider. A settlement that had access to effective medical treatments could survive health crises that would wipe out communities that lacked this knowledge, but medical knowledge was often closely guarded within families or specialist groups, which meant that it couldn't easily spread to other communities that might need it. The psychological techniques that Viking communities developed for maintaining mental health during winter months were perhaps their most important and least understood survival innovations. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, and isolation psychology gives us some insight into the mental health challenges that Vikings faced, but they had to develop solutions to these problems without any understanding of the underlying psychological mechanisms. The evidence suggests that successful Viking communities developed elaborate systems of social interaction, physical activity, and mental stimulation that helped prevent the psychological breakdown that could destroy community cohesion during winter months. These systems included everything from organized games and competitions to structured work rotations that ensured everyone had meaningful tasks to perform. But these psychological interventions had to be carefully balanced against the practical demands of survival, which meant that communities had to develop sophisticated understanding of human psychology, even though they lacked the scientific framework that we use to understand these issues today. The impact of winter survival on Viking family structures was profound and often tragic. The nuclear family units that we consider normal were often impossible to maintain during winter survival situations. Children might be separated from their parents and placed with families that were better equipped to care for them. Elderly family members might be abandoned or killed when resources became too scarce to support them. Marriage relationships might be dissolved or restructured based on survival needs rather than emotional bonds. These family disruptions created psychological trauma that affected entire communities for generations. Children who were separated from their parents during winter crises often struggled with attachment disorders and trust issues that made it difficult for them to form stable relationships as adults. Adults who were forced to abandon family members often suffered from guilt and depression that affected their ability to function effectively in survival situations. The social fabric of Viking communities was constantly being torn apart and rebuilt based on the harsh realities of winter survival. But these family disruptions also created new forms of social organization that were remarkably resilient and adaptable. Viking communities developed complex systems of adoption, fostering, and extended family relationships that ensured children would be cared for even if their biological parents died or became unable to provide for them. These systems were far more flexible and responsive than the rigid family structures that characterized many other medieval societies. The economic systems that Viking communities developed during winter months were unlike anything else in the medieval world. The normal concepts of property ownership, trade, and economic exchange that governed summer activities often became completely irrelevant during winter survival situations. Food, fuel, and shelter were distributed based on survival needs rather than economic relationships. People who were wealthy during the summer might find themselves dependent on others during winter, while people who had valuable winter survival skills might gain temporary economic power regardless of their normal social status. This seasonal economic disruption created unique forms of social mobility that didn't exist in most other historical societies. A person who developed valuable winter survival innovations could potentially improve their social and economic position dramatically, but they could also lose everything if their innovations failed or if they made critical mistakes during survival situations. The economic inequality that characterized Viking society during the active season was often completely reversed during winter months, when survival skills became more valuable than traditional forms of wealth. The archaeological evidence shows us that some Viking communities developed sophisticated systems of resource banking and insurance that helped them manage the economic disruptions caused by winter survival needs. These systems involved complex networks of mutual obligation and resource sharing that spread survival risks across multiple families and communities. But these systems also created new forms of social tension and conflict when people failed to meet their obligations, or when resources became too scarce to maintain the reciprocal relationships that the systems depended on. The technological innovations that Viking communities developed during winter survival situations were often far more sophisticated than anything they used during their summer activities. The harsh conditions and limited resources of winter forced them to develop incredibly efficient and effective tools, building techniques, and resource management systems. But these innovations were often specific to particular locations and circumstances, which meant that they couldn't easily be transferred to other communities or situations. The heating systems that Vikings developed for their longhouses were remarkably sophisticated, given their limited resources and materials. They learned to create complex air circulation systems that could distribute heat efficiently throughout large buildings while minimizing fuel consumption and smoke production. They developed techniques for storing and managing heat that could keep buildings warm for hours after fires had died down. But these systems required constant maintenance and expert knowledge that was often lost when communities failed or when key individuals died. The food preservation and storage techniques that Vikings developed during winter survival situations were equally sophisticated and equally vulnerable to knowledge loss. They learned to create complex preservation systems that could keep food safe and nutritious for months or even years. They developed techniques for managing humidity, temperature, and air circulation that could prevent spoilage and contamination. But these techniques required precise timing, careful monitoring, and expert knowledge that was difficult to preserve and transfer. The construction techniques that Vikings used for winter shelters were far more advanced than the simple wooden buildings that most people associate with Viking architecture. They learned to create buildings that could withstand extreme weather conditions while maintaining internal climate control and structural integrity. They developed techniques for insulation, weatherproofing, and structural reinforcement that were remarkably effective given their limited materials and tools. But perhaps the most impressive technological achievement of Viking winter survival was their development of complex systems integration that allowed all of these individual innovations to work together effectively. A successful Viking winter settlement wasn't just a collection of individual survival techniques. It was an integrated system where heating, food storage, construction, and social organization all worked together to create conditions where human life could be sustained through impossible environmental challenges. The failure of any single component in these integrated systems could trigger cascade failures that would destroy entire communities. A heating system that failed could make food storage impossible, which could lead to social breakdown, which could make it impossible to maintain the construction and maintenance work that kept the heating system functioning. The communities that survived were the ones that managed to maintain all of these complex systems simultaneously. But the communities that failed often collapsed with shocking speed once the integration started to break down. This systems integration approach to survival helps explain why Viking communities were so successful in some environments and so catastrophically unsuccessful in others. The techniques that worked perfectly in one location might be completely inappropriate for different environmental conditions, and communities that tried to apply successful techniques in inappropriate situations often failed spectacularly. The knowledge of how to adapt these integrated systems to new environments was perhaps the most valuable and most difficult to preserve aspect of Viking winter survival expertise. The communities that mastered this systems integration approach became the foundation for the most successful Viking settlements and the launching points for the most ambitious exploration and colonization efforts. But the communities that failed to develop these integrated approaches often left behind only scattered artifacts and mysterious ruins that hint at the enormous human cost of learning to survive in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The legacy of Viking winter survival extends far beyond the historical period when these communities existed. The techniques, social structures, and psychological frameworks that they developed influenced the development of cold weather survival strategies that are still used today. The integration of technology, social organization, and psychological preparation that characterized successful Viking winter communities became the foundation for many later developments in extreme environment survival. But perhaps the most important legacy of Viking winter survival is the demonstration that human beings are capable of adapting to environmental conditions that seem impossible to survive. The Vikings proved that with sufficient knowledge, social cooperation, and psychological preparation, humans can create sustainable communities even in environments where individual survival seems impossible. Their achievements provide both inspiration and practical guidance for modern efforts to establish human settlements in extreme environments, from Arctic research stations to space colonies. The story of Viking winter survival is ultimately a story about the incredible resilience and adaptability of human beings when they are forced to confront existential challenges. It's a story about communities that faced impossible odds and found ways to not just survive, but to thrive and expand into new territories. But it's also a story about the enormous human cost of pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and the countless communities and individuals who paid the ultimate price for the knowledge and achievements that we celebrate today. The winter survival techniques that Vikings developed weren't just impressive for their time. They were so advanced that some of them wouldn't be rediscovered by European civilization for centuries after the Viking Age ended. When the climate began cooling during the late medieval period, many of the communities that had replaced Viking settlements found themselves completely unprepared for conditions that Vikings had routinely survived. The knowledge that had kept entire populations alive through impossible winters had been lost, and the consequences were devastating. This knowledge loss happened because Viking winter survival expertise was incredibly specialized and difficult to preserve. Unlike agricultural techniques or basic crafts that could be easily taught and practiced, winter survival required the integration of dozens of different skills that all had to work together perfectly. A person might master food preservation techniques, but lack the construction skills needed to build proper storage facilities. Someone else might understand heating systems, but not have the social leadership skills needed to organize community survival efforts. The most successful Viking communities were the ones that managed to concentrate all of these different types of expertise within a small group of people who could work together effectively. But this concentration of knowledge also made the communities extremely vulnerable to sudden losses of key individuals. The death of a master builder, an expert food manager, or a skilled weather predictor could cripple a community's ability to survive the next winter. Archaeological evidence shows us settlements that appear to have been thriving one year and completely abandoned the next, suggesting that the loss of critical knowledge could trigger rapid community collapse. The social mechanisms that Viking communities developed to preserve and transfer winter survival knowledge were remarkably sophisticated, but also extremely fragile. Knowledge was typically passed down through family lines, with each generation learning from their parents and grandparents. But this system only worked when families remained intact and when there was enough time for proper knowledge transfer. During particularly harsh winters or crisis situations, the normal knowledge transfer process could be disrupted, leaving entire communities without access to essential survival information. The apprenticeship systems that Vikings used for specialized winter survival skills were even more vulnerable to disruption. A young person learning advanced heating system maintenance or complex food preservation techniques might need years of training before they could work independently. If their teacher died or became incapacitated before the training was complete, the knowledge could be lost forever. The archaeological record shows a settlements where sophisticated survival technologies were abandoned mid-construction, suggesting that the people who knew how to complete them had died or disappeared. The psychological aspects of knowledge preservation were equally challenging. Winter survival knowledge wasn't just technical information, it was deeply embedded in cultural practices, social relationships, and psychological frameworks that helped people cope with extreme stress. A person might know all the technical details of how to manage food stores during a harsh winter, but without the psychological preparation and social support systems that made it possible to actually implement these techniques under pressure, the knowledge was essentially useless. The most devastating aspect of this knowledge loss was that it often happened gradually in ways that communities didn't recognize until it was too late. A settlement might successfully survive several winters using traditional techniques, but each year they might lose a small piece of their knowledge base. An elderly expert might die before fully training a replacement. A crucial technique might be simplified or modified in ways that reduced its effectiveness. A social practice that supported winter survival might be abandoned as communities adapted to changing circumstances. Over time, these small losses would accumulate until the community's survival capabilities were severely compromised. But because the degradation happened slowly, people often didn't realize how vulnerable they had become until they faced a winter that was just slightly more challenging than what they were prepared for. The final collapse, when it came, often appeared sudden and inexplicable to the people experiencing it, even though it was actually the result of years or decades of gradual knowledge erosion. The communities that were most successful at preserving winter survival knowledge were often the ones that developed redundant systems for knowledge storage and transfer. They might have multiple people learning the same critical skills, or they might develop ways of documenting important information that didn't rely entirely on human memory. But these redundant systems required resources and social organization that many communities couldn't maintain during the constant pressure of winter survival. The religious and cultural practices that supported knowledge preservation were equally important and equally vulnerable. The storytelling traditions that preserved technical information, the ritual practices that reinforced social cooperation, and the educational systems that trained new generations of survival experts all required stable communities with enough resources to support non-productive activities. During crisis periods, these knowledge preservation activities were often the first things to be abandoned as communities focused all their energy on immediate survival needs. The loss of winter survival knowledge had cascading effects that extended far beyond individual communities. When settlements failed, they often took with them innovations and techniques that might have been crucial for other communities facing similar challenges. The knowledge of how to adapt survival techniques to specific environmental conditions, how to modify traditional practices for changing circumstances, and how to integrate different survival strategies into effective systems often died with the communities that had developed it. This knowledge loss also affected the broader Viking expansion efforts. The settlements that served as stepping stones for further exploration and colonization were often the ones that had mastered the most advanced winter survival techniques. When these communities failed, they not only lost their own populations, They also eliminated the infrastructure and expertise that would have been needed to support continued expansion into new territories. The contraction of Viking settlement areas during the later medieval period wasn't just due to climate change and political pressures. It was also the result of the gradual loss of the specialized knowledge that had made expansion possible in the first place. The archaeological evidence for this knowledge loss is both fascinating and heartbreaking. We find settlements where sophisticated survival technologies were built and then abandoned, suggesting that the knowledge of how to maintain them had been lost. We see evidence of communities that reverted to less effective survival techniques, indicating that they had lost access to more advanced methods. We find sites where traditional Viking construction techniques were replaced with inferior methods that were more familiar to the builders, but less effective for winter survival. Perhaps most poignantly, we find evidence of communities that appear to have been experimenting with survival techniques right up until the moment they collapsed. These sites show us people who were clearly trying to adapt and innovate, but who lacked the integrated knowledge systems that would have allowed them to succeed. They had pieces of the puzzle, but not enough pieces to create viable solutions to their survival challenges. The speed with which winter survival knowledge could be lost was terrifying. A community that had successfully survived dozens of winters could find itself completely unprepared for conditions that were only slightly more challenging than what they had previously experienced. The knowledge that had kept their ancestors alive for generations could disappear in a single winter if key individuals died or if social systems broke down under stress. This rapid knowledge loss helps explain why Viking expansion into new territories was so risky and why so many settlements failed. Each new settlement was essentially starting from scratch, trying to adapt existing survival techniques to new environmental conditions, without the safety net of accumulated local knowledge. The communities that succeeded were often the ones that could maintain their knowledge systems long enough to develop local expertise, but the communities that failed often collapsed before they could complete this adaptation process. The social dynamics of knowledge loss were particularly complex during winter survival situations. The same conditions that made knowledge preservation critical also made it extremely difficult to maintain the social structures that knowledge preservation required. When communities were under extreme survival pressure, the normal processes of education, apprenticeship, and cultural transmission were often disrupted. People were too focused on immediate survival needs to invest time and energy in teaching others or preserving information for future use. The hierarchical nature of Viking society also contributed to knowledge loss in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The most critical winter survival knowledge was often concentrated among the most skilled and experienced community members, who were also the people most likely to be involved in dangerous activities like hunting, trading, or resource gathering. When these individuals died or became incapacitated, entire communities could lose access to essential survival information. The gender dynamics of knowledge preservation were equally complex. Women often possessed crucial knowledge about food preservation, household management, and childcare that was essential for winter survival. But this knowledge was sometimes devalued or marginalized in favor of more visible male activities like hunting or construction. When communities failed to properly integrate and preserve women's knowledge, they often lost critical survival capabilities without realizing it. The children in these communities faced particular challenges when it came to knowledge acquisition. The harsh conditions of winter survival meant that children often had to contribute to survival efforts from a very young age, but they also needed time and resources for education that communities couldn't always provide. The balance between immediate survival needs and long-term knowledge preservation was constantly shifting, and communities that got this balance wrong often paid a terrible price. The psychological toll of knowledge loss was enormous for the individuals who experienced it. Imagine being responsible for your community's survival and gradually realizing that you no longer possessed the knowledge that your ancestors had used to survive similar conditions. The guilt, fear, and desperation that people must have felt as they watched their communities struggle with problems that previous generations had solved is almost impossible to comprehend. The documentation of this knowledge loss process is limited because the communities that were most affected by it were often the ones least able to preserve records of their experiences. The settlements that succeeded in maintaining their knowledge systems were more likely to produce the sagas, artifacts, and historical records that we use to understand Viking winter survival. The communities that failed often left behind only scattered archaeological evidence that hints at their struggles, but doesn't provide detailed information about what went wrong. The regional variations in knowledge loss patterns were significant and revealing. Communities in different geographic areas faced different survival challenges and developed different solutions, which meant that the loss of knowledge had different effects depending on local conditions. A technique that was crucial for survival in one area might be less important in another, which meant that the same knowledge loss event could have dramatically different consequences for different communities. The timing of knowledge loss events was also critical. A community that lost key survival knowledge during a mild winter might have time to recover and develop alternative solutions before facing more challenging conditions. But a community that lost critical knowledge just before a harsh winter often had no opportunity to adapt and recover. The archaeological evidence suggests that many Viking settlements were eliminated by this kind of unfortunate timing, where knowledge loss coincided with environmental challenges that the communities were no longer equipped to handle. The interconnected nature of Viking survival knowledge meant that the loss of any single element could trigger cascading failures that affected multiple aspects of community survival. The loss of advanced heating techniques could make food storage more difficult, which could lead to nutritional problems that reduced people's ability to perform the physical labor needed for construction and maintenance, which could cause further deterioration of survival infrastructure. These cascade effects could accelerate community collapse in ways that were difficult to predict or prevent. The economic implications of knowledge loss were equally severe. Winter survival techniques often required significant investments of time, labor, and resources that had to be made during the warmer months when communities were also trying to manage their normal economic activities. The loss of knowledge about how to make these investments efficiently could force communities to choose between immediate economic needs and long-term survival preparation. Communities that made the wrong choices often found themselves facing winter with inadequate preparation and no way to recover from their mistakes. The technological regression that accompanied knowledge loss was particularly visible in the archaeological record. We can see evidence of communities that abandoned sophisticated survival technologies in favor of simpler techniques that were easier to maintain but less effective for winter survival. This technological regression often preceded community collapse by several years, suggesting that people were aware of their deteriorating capabilities but were unable to reverse the process. The social fragmentation that accompanied knowledge loss was equally destructive. As communities lost the ability to maintain their traditional survival systems, they often experienced increasing social conflict and decreased cooperation. The social bonds that had held communities together during previous survival crises began to break down as people lost confidence in their collective ability to survive. This social fragmentation made it even more difficult to preserve and transfer the knowledge that remained, creating a vicious cycle that often ended in complete community collapse. The psychological effects of watching a community's survival capabilities deteriorate were devastating for the individuals who experienced them. People who had grown up with confidence in their community's ability to survive anything nature could throw at them suddenly found themselves facing the possibility that their traditional ways of life were no longer viable. The anxiety, depression, and despair that accompanied this realization often made it even more difficult for communities to organize effective responses to their survival challenges. The loss of winter survival knowledge also had profound effects on Viking culture and identity. The ability to survive impossible winters had been central to Viking self-conception and cultural pride. Communities that lost this capability often experienced a crisis of cultural identity that was just as devastating as the practical survival challenges they faced. The stories, rituals, and social practices that had supported winter survival were often abandoned along with the technical knowledge, leaving communities without the cultural framework they needed to maintain social cohesion during crisis periods. The speed with which cultural knowledge could disappear was remarkable and terrifying. Practices that had been central to community life for generations could be forgotten in a single winter if the people who maintained them died or if social structures broke down under stress. The oral traditions that preserved technical information, the ritual practices that reinforced social cooperation, and the educational systems that trained new generations could all disappear with shocking rapidity when communities were under extreme pressure. The archaeological evidence shows us that many Viking communities made desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge, even as they were collapsing. We find evidence of communities that tried to document their survival techniques in physical artifacts, that attempted to simplify complex knowledge systems to make them easier to preserve, and that made extraordinary efforts to maintain their cultural practices, even when they lacked the resources to do so effectively. These efforts rarely succeeded, but they provide moving testimony to the value that these communities placed on preserving their survival heritage. The regional networks that had supported knowledge sharing between Viking communities also began to break down as individual settlements failed. The trading relationships, kinship connections, and cultural exchanges that had allowed successful survival techniques to spread from one community to another were disrupted when key settlements collapsed. This network fragmentation meant that communities that might have been able to survive with outside knowledge and support found themselves isolated and unable to access the resources they needed. The climate changes that occurred during the later medieval period accelerated knowledge loss by making traditional survival techniques less effective. Communities that had developed their winter survival systems during warmer periods found that their techniques were inadequate for the colder conditions that began to prevail after 1300 CE. The knowledge that had kept them alive for generations was suddenly insufficient, but they lacked the time and resources needed to develop new techniques that could handle the changing conditions. The political changes that accompanied the end of the Viking Age also contributed to knowledge loss. The centralized kingdoms that replaced Viking communities often had different priorities and different approaches to resource management that didn't support the maintenance of traditional winter survival knowledge. The local autonomy that had allowed Viking communities to develop specialized survival techniques was gradually eliminated as larger political entities imposed standardized approaches that were less adapted to local conditions. The religious changes that occurred during the Christianization of Scandinavia also affected knowledge preservation. The storytelling traditions, ritual practices, and cultural frameworks that had supported winter survival knowledge were often associated with pagan beliefs that were actively suppressed by Christian authorities. The loss of these cultural support systems made it much more difficult to preserve and transfer the technical knowledge that they had maintained. The economic changes that accompanied the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also reduced communities' ability to maintain winter survival knowledge. The focus on monetary exchange and market-based resource allocation that characterized the later medieval economy was often incompatible with the resource sharing and community cooperation that Viking winter survival required. Communities that adopted these new economic systems often found that they had lost the social mechanisms that had supported their survival capabilities. The educational changes that occurred during this transition period were equally significant. The formal educational systems that began to develop during the later medieval period were focused on literacy, religious instruction, and administrative skills that were valuable for the emerging political and economic systems. But these educational systems didn't preserve the practical survival knowledge that had been central to Viking culture. The apprenticeship systems and informal knowledge transfer mechanisms that had maintained winter survival expertise were gradually replaced by educational approaches that didn't support these capabilities. The urbanization that began during the later medieval period also contributed to knowledge loss. As people moved from rural settlements to towns and cities, they lost direct contact with the environmental conditions that had shaped Viking winter survival techniques. The knowledge that had been essential for survival in rural settlements became irrelevant for urban populations, and the social structures that had supported knowledge preservation in small communities were difficult to maintain in larger urban environments. The technological changes that occurred during this period created both opportunities and challenges for knowledge preservation. The development of writing systems made it theoretically possible to document survival techniques in ways that had been impossible during the earlier Viking period. But the people who possessed this knowledge were often illiterate, and the people who could write often lacked the practical experience needed to accurately document survival techniques. The few attempts to preserve winter survival knowledge in written form were often incomplete or inaccurate, and they couldn't capture the social and psychological aspects of survival that were crucial for successful implementation. The military changes that occurred during the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also affected knowledge preservation. The professional military systems that replaced Viking warrior bands had different training requirements and different approaches to resource management. The survival skills that had been essential for Viking warriors were often irrelevant for medieval soldiers, and the social structures that had supported these capabilities were gradually eliminated as military organization became more centralized and specialized. The demographic changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The population growth that characterized much of the later medieval period created new pressures on resources and new approaches to community organization that were often incompatible with traditional Viking survival techniques. The smaller, more autonomous communities that had developed and maintained winter survival knowledge were gradually absorbed into larger political and economic systems that had different priorities and different approaches to resource management. The environmental changes that occurred during this period created new challenges that traditional survival techniques weren't designed to handle. The deforestation that accompanied population growth reduced the availability of fuel and building materials that were essential for winter survival. The soil depletion that resulted from intensive agriculture reduced the productivity of food systems that communities depended on for winter survival. The climate changes that began during the later medieval period created new weather patterns that traditional survival techniques weren't designed to handle. The trade changes that occurred during this period also affected knowledge preservation. The long-distance trading networks that had supported Viking expansion and colonization were gradually replaced by different commercial systems that had different requirements and different approaches to resource management. The knowledge that had been essential for managing resources in isolated settlements became less relevant as communities became more integrated into larger economic systems. The legal changes that occurred during the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also contributed to knowledge loss. The customary legal systems that had supported Viking communities were gradually replaced by written legal codes that were administered by centralized authorities. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop specialized survival techniques was reduced as legal systems became more standardized and less responsive to local conditions. The social changes that accompanied these broader transformations were equally significant. The egalitarian social structures that had characterized many Viking communities were gradually replaced by more hierarchical systems that concentrated power and resources in the hands of fewer individuals. The community cooperation that had been essential for winter survival was more difficult to maintain in these hierarchical systems, and the social bonds that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually weakened. The cultural changes that occurred during this period were perhaps the most devastating for knowledge preservation. The cultural values that had supported winter survival, including the emphasis on practical skills, community cooperation, and adaptation to environmental challenges, were gradually replaced by different values that were more compatible with the emerging political and economic systems. The pride in survival capabilities that had been central to Viking identity was replaced by different sources of cultural identity that didn't support the maintenance of traditional knowledge. The psychological changes that accompanied these broader transformations were equally significant. The confidence in community survival capabilities that had sustained Viking communities through impossible challenges was gradually replaced by dependence on external authorities and systems. The psychological resilience that had been essential for winter survival was no longer cultivated or valued in the same way, and the mental frameworks that had supported survival knowledge were gradually abandoned. The educational changes that occurred during this period were particularly significant for knowledge preservation. The informal educational systems that had maintained winter survival knowledge were gradually replaced by formal educational systems that had different priorities and different approaches to knowledge transfer. The apprenticeship systems that had trained survival experts were gradually eliminated as economic and social systems changed, and the cultural practices that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually abandoned. The technological changes that occurred during this period created new possibilities for knowledge preservation, but they also created new challenges. The development of better construction techniques, more effective heating systems, and more efficient food preservation methods made it theoretically possible to survive winter conditions with less specialized knowledge. But these technological improvements also reduced the incentive to maintain traditional survival knowledge, and the social structures that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually weakened as communities became more dependent on external technologies. The economic changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The market-based economic systems that gradually replaced traditional resource management approaches were often more efficient for normal conditions, but they were less resilient for crisis situations. The redundant resource systems and community cooperation mechanisms that had supported winter survival were gradually eliminated as economic systems became more specialized and efficient. The political changes that occurred during this period also affected knowledge preservation. The centralized political systems that replaced Viking communities were often more effective at organizing large-scale activities and managing resources across wide areas, but they were less responsive to local conditions and less supportive of the specialized knowledge that had been essential for winter survival. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop and maintain survival techniques was gradually reduced as political systems became more centralized. The religious changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The Christian religious systems that gradually replaced traditional Norse beliefs had different values and different approaches to knowledge preservation. The storytelling traditions and cultural practices that had supported winter survival knowledge were often associated with pagan beliefs that were actively suppressed, and the social structures that had maintained these traditions were gradually eliminated. The demographic changes that occurred during this period created new challenges for knowledge preservation. The population mobility that characterized the later medieval period made it more difficult to maintain the stable communities that had supported knowledge transfer. The urbanization that began during this period drew people away from the rural environments where winter survival knowledge was most relevant, and the social structures that had supported knowledge preservation in small communities were difficult to maintain in larger urban environments. The environmental changes that occurred during this period created new challenges that traditional survival techniques weren't designed to handle. The climate changes that began during the later medieval period created new weather patterns that required different survival strategies. The ecological changes that resulted from human activity created new resource constraints that traditional techniques weren't designed to manage. The landscape changes that occurred as political and economic systems changed created new challenges for communities that had developed their survival techniques for different environmental conditions. The speed with which these changes occurred was remarkable and devastating for knowledge preservation. Traditional survival systems that had been developed over centuries were often eliminated in a matter of decades as communities adapted to new political, economic, and social conditions. The knowledge that had kept entire populations alive through impossible challenges was often lost before people fully understood what they were giving up. The irreversible nature of this knowledge loss was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire process. Once communities lost the ability to maintain their traditional survival systems, they often found it impossible to recover these capabilities even when they realized their importance. The social structures, cultural practices, and psychological frameworks that had supported winter survival knowledge were so complex and so interdependent that they couldn't be easily reconstructed once they had been abandoned. The archaeological evidence for this knowledge loss process is both extensive and heartbreaking. We find evidence of communities that gradually abandoned sophisticated survival techniques in favor of simpler approaches that were easier to maintain but less effective for winter survival. We see evidence of technological regression as communities lost the ability to maintain complex survival systems. We find evidence of social fragmentation as communities lost the cooperation mechanisms that had supported their survival capabilities. But perhaps most poignantly, we find evidence of communities that were clearly aware of their deteriorating survival capabilities and were making desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge even as they were collapsing. These sites show us people who understood the value of what they were losing and who made extraordinary efforts to maintain their traditional ways of life even when they lacked the resources to do so effectively. Their failure wasn't due to ignorance or lack of effort. It was due to the overwhelming nature of the challenges they faced and the inadequacy of the support systems available to them. The legacy of this knowledge loss extends far beyond the historical period when it occurred. The winter survival techniques that Vikings developed represented some of the most sophisticated approaches to extreme environment survival that humans had ever developed. The loss of this knowledge eliminated capabilities that might have been crucial for later human expansion into challenging environments. The social structures and cultural practices that had supported these capabilities were also lost, eliminating models of human organization that might have been valuable for other survival challenges. The lessons from this knowledge loss process are sobering for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation. They demonstrate that even the most sophisticated survival systems can be lost with shocking rapidity when the social and cultural structures that support them are disrupted. They show that knowledge preservation requires constant effort and resources that may not be available during crisis periods. They reveal that the loss of survival capabilities can create cascading failures that are difficult to predict and impossible to reverse once they begin. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that human survival in extreme environments isn't just a matter of individual capability or technological innovation. It requires complex social systems, cultural practices, and psychological frameworks that must be maintained across generations. The Vikings who achieved legendary survival capabilities did so not just because they were tough individuals, but because they had developed and maintained incredibly sophisticated social systems that supported their survival efforts. The loss of these social systems was ultimately more devastating than any environmental challenge that Viking communities faced. The climate changes, resource constraints, and political pressures that contributed to the end of the Viking Age were certainly significant, but they were challenges that Viking communities had successfully managed in the past. What made these challenges insurmountable was the gradual erosion of the social and cultural systems that had made Viking survival possible in the first place. Understanding this process of knowledge loss helps us appreciate the true magnitude of Viking achievements and the tragedy of their eventual decline. It also provides crucial insights for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation in extreme environments. The Vikings proved that humans are capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that seem impossible, but they also demonstrated that these capabilities can be lost with shocking rapidity when the social and cultural systems that support them are disrupted. The story of Viking winter survival is ultimately a story about the incredible resilience and adaptability of human communities when they are supported by appropriate social and cultural systems. But it's also a story about the fragility of these systems and the devastating consequences when they fail. The Vikings who achieved legendary survival capabilities did so through the development of incredibly sophisticated social technologies that were just as important as their physical technologies. The loss of these social technologies was ultimately what ended the Viking Age and eliminated some of the most impressive survival capabilities that humans had ever developed. The implications of this story extend far beyond historical interest. As modern humans face new environmental challenges and consider expansion into extreme environments, the lessons from Viking winter survival become increasingly relevant. The Vikings demonstrated that human survival in impossible conditions is achievable, but they also demonstrated that it requires the development and maintenance of social and cultural systems that are far more complex and fragile than most people realize. Understanding these requirements is crucial for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation in the challenging environments that we may face in the future. The complete breakdown of Viking winter survival knowledge didn't happen overnight, but when it did collapse, entire ways of life vanished so completely that we're still trying to piece together what these people actually knew. Imagine spending your entire life learning survival techniques that your great-grandfather had perfected, only to watch your children abandon them because they seemed too difficult or too old-fashioned. This wasn't just a loss of practical skills, it was the destruction of entire worldviews that had sustained human life in impossible conditions for centuries. The most devastating aspect of this knowledge collapse was how it affected the survivors who remembered the old ways. Archaeological evidence shows us individuals who clearly possessed advanced survival knowledge, but were living in communities that could no longer support the implementation of these techniques. We find sites where someone built a sophisticated heating system using traditional methods, but the rest of the community was using inferior techniques that couldn't maintain the complex infrastructure that the advanced system required. These individuals must have experienced a form of psychological torture that's difficult for us to comprehend. They possessed knowledge that could have saved lives, but they were trapped in social systems that no longer valued or supported their expertise. The frustration of watching people die from problems that you know how to solve, but being unable to convince them to implement your solutions, must have been overwhelming. The archaeological record suggests that many of these knowledge holders eventually abandoned their communities entirely, preferring to die alone in the wilderness rather than watch their neighbors suffer from ignorance. The children who grew up during this transition period faced particularly tragic circumstances. They were often the last generation to receive partial training in traditional survival techniques, but they inherited communities that could no longer provide the social support and resource base that these techniques required. These children grew up with fragments of incredibly valuable knowledge, but without the cultural context that would have allowed them to use this knowledge effectively. The archaeological evidence shows us that many of these transitional communities developed hybrid survival systems that combined traditional Viking techniques with newer approaches that were easier to maintain but less effective for extreme conditions. These hybrid systems often worked adequately during mild winters, but they failed catastrophically when communities faced the kind of extreme conditions that traditional Viking techniques had been designed to handle. The gradual nature of this transition meant that communities often didn't realize how much of their survival capacity they had lost until they faced a crisis that revealed the inadequacy of their new approaches. We find evidence of settlements that had successfully survived dozens of winters using hybrid techniques, but then collapsed completely when they encountered conditions that were only slightly more challenging than what they had previously experienced. The speed with which survival knowledge could be lost was matched only by the speed with which communities could collapse once they realized their inadequacy. The archaeological record shows us sites where sophisticated survival preparations were abandoned mid-construction, suggesting that communities recognized their inability to complete traditional survival systems and simply gave up rather than attempt inadequate alternatives. The social dynamics of these failing communities were particularly tragic. The people who possessed the most valuable survival knowledge were often the elderly, who had learned traditional techniques during their youth but were no longer physically capable of implementing them. The people who were most capable of physical survival work were often the young, who had never learned the traditional techniques and didn't understand their importance. The middle-aged individuals who might have been able to bridge this gap were often the ones who were most focused on adapting to the new political and economic systems that were replacing traditional Viking society. This generational knowledge gap created communities where survival expertise was distributed in ways that made it impossible to implement effectively. The elderly knew what needed to be done but couldn't do it. The young could do the work but didn't know what work needed to be done. The middle-aged were too busy adapting to changing circumstances to focus on preserving traditional knowledge. The result was communities that possessed all the knowledge and capability needed for survival, but couldn't organize these resources effectively enough to implement successful survival strategies. The psychological toll of this disorganization was enormous. Communities that had once been confident in their ability to survive anything nature could throw at them found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty and internal conflict. The social bonds that had held these communities together during previous crises began to break down as people lost confidence in their collective ability to survive. The cultural practices that had supported survival knowledge were abandoned as communities focused all their energy on immediate survival needs. The religious and spiritual frameworks that had sustained Viking communities during their darkest hours were also lost during this transition period. The beliefs about fate, honor, and cosmic struggle that had helped people cope with impossible survival challenges were replaced by different religious systems that didn't provide the same psychological support for extreme survival situations. The rituals and ceremonies that had reinforced community bonds and survival knowledge were abandoned as communities converted to Christianity and adopted new cultural practices. The loss of these psychological support systems was just as devastating as the loss of technical knowledge. People who had been psychologically prepared to make impossible sacrifices for community survival found themselves in communities that no longer shared these values or provided the cultural framework that made such sacrifices meaningful. The individual heroism that had characterized Viking survival efforts was replaced by dependence on external authorities and systems that couldn't provide the same level of support during crisis situations. The economic systems that had supported Viking winter survival were also dismantled during this transition period. The resource-sharing mechanisms that had allowed communities to survive extreme scarcity were replaced by market-based systems that were more efficient during normal conditions, but less resilient during crisis situations. The redundant storage systems and community cooperation mechanisms that had provided backup resources during emergencies were eliminated as economic systems became more specialized and efficient. The political systems that had supported Viking survival capabilities were equally disrupted. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop specialized survival techniques was reduced as centralized authorities imposed standardized approaches that were less adapted to local conditions. The decision-making processes that had allowed communities to respond quickly to survival challenges were replaced by more hierarchical systems that were less responsive to local needs. The military systems that had supported Viking communities were also transformed in ways that reduced survival capabilities. The warrior bands that had provided both external defense and internal survival expertise were replaced by professional military systems that had different training requirements and different approaches to resource management. The survival skills that had been essential for Viking warriors were often irrelevant for medieval soldiers, and the social structures that had supported these capabilities were gradually eliminated. The trade networks that had supported Viking expansion and survival were also disrupted during this transition period. The long-distance trading relationships that had provided access to essential resources were replaced by different commercial systems that had different requirements and different approaches to resource management. The knowledge that had been essential for managing resources in isolated settlements became less relevant as communities became more integrated into larger economic systems. The construction techniques that had supported Viking survival capabilities were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to build structures that could withstand extreme weather conditions while maintaining internal climate control was replaced by different construction approaches that were more suitable for the new political and economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The materials and techniques that had been essential for traditional construction were often no longer available or were considered too expensive for the new economic systems. The food preservation techniques that had been essential for Viking winter survival were also abandoned during this transition period. The knowledge of how to preserve food for extended periods using traditional methods was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The storage systems and preservation techniques that had been essential for traditional survival were often considered too labor-intensive or too expensive for the new economic systems. The heating systems that had been essential for Viking winter survival were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to create efficient heating systems using limited resources was replaced by different approaches that required more resources but were easier to maintain. The complex air circulation systems and heat storage techniques that had been essential for traditional survival were often considered too complicated or too expensive for the new economic systems. The water management systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also disrupted during this transition period. The knowledge of how to manage water resources during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for normal conditions, but less effective during crisis situations. The storage systems and distribution techniques that had been essential for traditional survival were often considered unnecessary for the new economic systems. The tool-making techniques that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to create and maintain tools that could function effectively in extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The materials and techniques that had been essential for traditional tool-making were often no longer available or were considered too expensive for the new economic systems. The clothing and equipment techniques that had been essential for Viking survival were also abandoned during this transition period. The knowledge of how to create clothing and equipment that could protect people during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new social systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The materials and techniques that had been essential for traditional clothing and equipment were often no longer available, or were considered too expensive for the new economic systems. The transportation techniques that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to travel safely during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new political systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The vehicles and techniques that had been essential for traditional transportation were often considered too specialized or too expensive for the new economic systems. The communication systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also disrupted during this transition period. The knowledge of how to maintain communication during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new political systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The signals and techniques that had been essential for traditional communication were often considered too primitive or too unreliable for the new administrative systems. The medical techniques that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to treat injuries and illnesses during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new social systems but less effective for extreme survival situations. The treatments and techniques that had been essential for traditional medicine were often considered too primitive or too dangerous for the new medical systems. The psychological techniques that had been essential for Viking survival were also abandoned during this transition period. The knowledge of how to maintain mental health during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new religious systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The practices and techniques that had been essential for traditional psychological support were often considered too pagan or too dangerous for the new cultural systems. The educational systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also dismantled during this period. The knowledge of how to train people for extreme survival situations was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new political systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The apprenticeship systems and training techniques that had been essential for traditional education were often considered too informal or too specialized for the new educational systems. The social organization systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this transition period. The knowledge of how to organize communities for extreme survival situations was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new political systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The cooperation mechanisms and leadership techniques that had been essential for traditional social organization were often considered too informal or too unstable for the new administrative systems. The resource management systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also disrupted during this period. The knowledge of how to manage resources during extreme scarcity was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The allocation mechanisms and storage techniques that had been essential for traditional resource management were often considered too primitive or too inefficient for the new economic systems. The risk assessment systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this transition period. The knowledge of how to evaluate and manage risks during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The decision-making processes and evaluation techniques that had been essential for traditional risk assessment were often considered too informal or too unreliable for the new bureaucratic systems. The innovation systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also abandoned during this period. The knowledge of how to develop and implement new survival techniques was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new political systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The experimentation processes and adaptation techniques that had been essential for traditional innovation were often considered too dangerous or too wasteful for the new administrative systems. The quality control systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also disrupted during this transition period. The knowledge of how to maintain standards during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The inspection processes and correction techniques that had been essential for traditional quality control were often considered too informal or too expensive for the new economic systems. The maintenance systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to maintain equipment and infrastructure during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The repair processes and replacement techniques that had been essential for traditional maintenance were often considered too specialized or too expensive for the new economic systems. The backup systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also eliminated during this transition period. The knowledge of how to create and maintain redundant systems during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The duplication processes and contingency techniques that had been essential for traditional backup systems were often considered too wasteful or too expensive for the new economic systems. The integration systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also dismantled during this period. The knowledge of how to coordinate multiple survival systems during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The coordination processes and synchronization techniques that had been essential for traditional integration were often considered too complex or too informal for the new bureaucratic systems. The monitoring systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this transition period. The knowledge of how to track conditions and performance during extreme situations was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The observation processes and reporting techniques that had been essential for traditional monitoring were often considered too primitive or too unreliable for the new bureaucratic systems. The documentation systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also disrupted during this period. The knowledge of how to preserve and transfer information during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new educational systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The recording processes and transmission techniques that had been essential for traditional documentation were often considered too informal or too unreliable for the new educational systems. The testing systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also abandoned during this transition period. The knowledge of how to evaluate techniques and equipment during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The validation processes and verification techniques that had been essential for traditional testing were often considered too dangerous or too expensive for the new administrative systems. The optimization systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this period. The knowledge of how to improve performance during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The refinement processes and enhancement techniques that had been essential for traditional optimization were often considered too specialized or too expensive for the new economic systems. The adaptation systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also eliminated during this transition period. The knowledge of how to modify techniques for changing conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The adjustment processes and modification techniques that had been essential for traditional adaptation were often considered too informal or too unreliable for the new bureaucratic systems. The recovery systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also dismantled during this period. The knowledge of how to restore capabilities after extreme events was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new economic systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The restoration processes and rehabilitation techniques that had been essential for traditional recovery were often considered too expensive or too time-consuming for the new economic systems. The emergency response systems that had been essential for Viking survival were also lost during this transition period. The knowledge of how to respond to crisis situations during extreme conditions was replaced by different approaches that were more suitable for the new administrative systems, but less effective for extreme survival situations. The reaction processes and intervention techniques that had been essential for traditional emergency response were often considered too informal or too dangerous for the new bureaucratic systems. The consequence of losing all these interconnected systems was a complete breakdown in the ability of former Viking communities to survive the kind of extreme conditions that their ancestors had routinely endured. The individual techniques and technologies that had made Viking winter survival possible were useless without the social, cultural, and organizational systems that had supported their implementation. The communities that had once been capable of surviving anything nature could throw at them found themselves helpless in the face of conditions that previous generations had considered manageable. The speed with which this comprehensive system collapse occurred was remarkable and terrifying. Communities that had maintained sophisticated survival capabilities for generations could lose them completely in a matter of decades, as the social and cultural systems that supported them were disrupted by larger political and economic changes. The knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of trial and error was lost in a single generation, as communities adapted to new circumstances that didn't support the maintenance of traditional survival systems. The irreversible nature of this system collapse was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire process. Once communities had lost the integrated systems that supported their survival capabilities, they found it impossible to recreate them even when they recognized their value. The social structures, cultural practices, and organizational systems that had supported Viking winter survival were so complex and so interdependent that they couldn't be reconstructed once they had been dismantled. The archaeological evidence for this comprehensive system collapse is both extensive and heartbreaking. We find evidence of communities that possessed all the individual components needed for survival, but couldn't organize them into effective systems. We see evidence of people who clearly understood the value of traditional techniques, but couldn't implement them without the social support systems that had been eliminated. We find evidence of communities that made desperate attempts to recreate traditional survival systems, but lacked the cultural knowledge and social organization that made these systems possible. The human cost of this system collapse was enormous and largely invisible to the people who were making the decisions that caused it. The political leaders, religious authorities, and economic administrators who were implementing the changes that dismantled Viking survival systems often had no understanding of what they were destroying. They saw traditional Viking practices as primitive, inefficient, or incompatible with modern civilization, and they actively worked to eliminate them, without realizing that they were destroying some of the most sophisticated survival capabilities that humans had ever developed. The communities that experienced this system collapse often didn't understand what was happening to them until it was too late to reverse the process. They saw individual changes as improvements or adaptations that would make their lives easier or more compatible with the changing world around them. They didn't realize that these individual changes were undermining the integrated systems that their survival depended on until they faced a crisis that revealed the inadequacy of their new approaches. The tragedy of this system collapse extends far beyond the immediate communities that experienced it. The loss of Viking winter survival capabilities eliminated some of the most sophisticated approaches to extreme environment survival that humans had ever developed. The knowledge, techniques, and social systems that had made this survival possible were lost forever, leaving humanity without access to capabilities that might have been crucial for future survival challenges. The lessons from this comprehensive system collapse are sobering and relevant for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation. They demonstrate that survival in extreme environments isn't just a matter of individual techniques or technologies, but depends on complex social, cultural, and organizational systems that must be maintained across generations. They show that these systems can be lost with shocking rapidity when the social and cultural conditions that support them are disrupted. They reveal that the loss of survival capabilities can have devastating consequences that extend far beyond the immediate communities that experience them. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that human survival achievements are far more fragile than they appear. The Vikings who achieved legendary survival capabilities did so through the development of incredibly sophisticated systems that were perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. When those circumstances changed, the systems that had made their achievements possible were no longer viable, and the capabilities that had sustained them for generations were lost forever. Understanding this fragility is crucial for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation in extreme environments. It reveals that survival capabilities aren't just technical achievements that can be preserved in books or museums, but depend on living social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and adapted to changing circumstances. The loss of these systems represents not just the end of particular survival techniques, but the elimination of entire ways of understanding and responding to environmental challenges. The story of how Viking winter survival capabilities were lost is ultimately a story about the complexity and fragility of human adaptation. It demonstrates that even the most impressive survival achievements depend on social and cultural systems that can be disrupted by forces beyond the control of the communities that depend on them. It shows that the preservation of survival capabilities requires not just technical knowledge, but the maintenance of the social, cultural, and organizational systems that make the implementation of this knowledge possible. The implications of this story extend far beyond historical interest. As modern humans face new environmental challenges and consider expansion into extreme environments, the lessons from the loss of Viking winter survival capabilities become increasingly relevant. They remind us that survival in extreme environments requires more than just individual capability or technological innovation. It requires the development and maintenance of complex social systems that can support survival efforts across generations. The loss of these systems can eliminate survival capabilities with shocking rapidity, leaving communities helpless in the face of challenges that previous generations had successfully managed. The Vikings proved that humans are capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that seem impossible, but they also demonstrated that these capabilities depend on social and cultural systems that are far more fragile than most people realize. Understanding this fragility is essential for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation, because it reveals that the preservation of survival capabilities requires constant attention to the social and cultural conditions that support them. The technical knowledge and individual skills that make survival possible are useless without the social systems that enable their implementation. And these social systems can be lost with devastating speed when the conditions that support them are disrupted. The story of Viking winter survival and its ultimate loss is a testament to both the incredible potential of human adaptation and the fragility of the social systems that make this adaptation possible. It reminds us that survival achievements aren't just individual accomplishments, but depend on complex social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and protected. The loss of these systems represents not just the end of particular survival techniques, but the elimination of entire ways of understanding and responding to environmental challenges that might be crucial for future human survival and adaptation. The archaeological record tells us that the final collapse of Viking winter survival knowledge happened so quickly that entire communities simply vanished between one winter and the next. These weren't gradual declines where we can trace the slow deterioration of survival capabilities over decades. These were sudden, catastrophic failures where settlements that had survived for generations were completely abandoned in a single season, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and the bones of people who had frozen to death in their own homes. What makes these sudden collapses even more terrifying is that they often occurred in communities that had successfully adapted to changing conditions for years. The archaeological evidence shows us settlements where people had been modifying their traditional survival techniques, experimenting with new approaches, and apparently succeeding in maintaining their communities through increasingly difficult winters. Then, without warning, we find evidence of complete system failure, where every survival strategy failed simultaneously. The speed of these collapses suggests that Viking winter survival systems had critical thresholds beyond which they simply couldn't function. Like a dam that can withstand increasing water pressure up to a certain point, but then fails catastrophically. When that threshold is exceeded, Viking communities could apparently adapt to gradually worsening conditions until they reached a breaking point where all their survival systems collapsed at once. The psychological impact of witnessing these sudden collapses must have been devastating for the survivors in neighboring communities. Imagine knowing that a settlement just a few miles away had been thriving the previous year, only to discover that every single person had died during the winter. The realization that your own community's survival systems might be just as fragile would have created a level of anxiety and desperation that's difficult for us to comprehend. This knowledge of sudden collapse vulnerability explains why Viking expansion efforts became increasingly desperate during the later medieval period. Communities that had lost confidence in their ability to survive in their traditional territories were willing to take enormous risks to establish new settlements in completely unknown environments. The voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and North America weren't just driven by curiosity or ambition, they were desperate attempts to escape from survival systems that people knew were failing. But these expansion efforts often simply transplanted the same system vulnerabilities to new environments, where they were even more likely to fail. The communities that established settlements in Iceland and Greenland were essentially betting their lives on their ability to adapt their failing survival systems to even more challenging conditions. the fact that many of these settlements succeeded, at least temporarily, demonstrates the incredible resourcefulness of the people who made these journeys. But it also shows how desperate their situation had become. The Greenland settlements represent perhaps the most extreme example of this desperate expansion strategy. The people who established these communities were essentially conducting a massive survival experiment in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They had to adapt their already vulnerable survival systems to conditions that were even more extreme than what they had left behind, all while being completely cut off from any possibility of rescue or resupply. The success of these Greenland settlements for several centuries demonstrates that Viking winter survival techniques were remarkably adaptable when they were properly supported by appropriate social and cultural systems. But their eventual collapse also demonstrates the ultimate fragility of these systems when they were pushed beyond their limits by changing environmental conditions and social pressures. The final collapse of the Greenland settlements around 1450 CE represents the end of the last communities that maintained the full range of Viking winter survival capabilities. When these settlements failed, they took with them the last living examples of the social and cultural systems that had made Viking winter survival possible. The knowledge that had sustained human life in impossible conditions for centuries died with the last inhabitants of these remote Arctic communities. The irony of this final collapse is that it occurred just as European civilization was entering a period of unprecedented technological and social development. The Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the Scientific Revolution were all beginning to transform European society in ways that would have made Viking winter survival knowledge incredibly valuable. But this knowledge was lost just when it might have been most useful for human expansion into new and challenging environments. The timing of this knowledge loss also meant that the European explorers and colonists who followed in the Vikings' footsteps had to rediscover survival techniques that had already been perfected centuries earlier. The Arctic explorers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries faced many of the same challenges that Vikings had successfully overcome. But they had to develop their own solutions without access to the accumulated knowledge that Viking communities had preserved for generations. The human cost of this lost knowledge was enormous. How many Arctic expeditions failed because they lacked survival techniques that Vikings had mastered? How many potential settlements were abandoned because colonists couldn't survive conditions that Viking communities had thrived in? How many lives were lost because people didn't have access to winter survival knowledge that had been perfected through centuries of trial and error? The psychological frameworks that had sustained Viking communities through their darkest hours were also lost during this period. The cultural values, religious beliefs, and social practices that had helped people cope with extreme survival challenges were replaced by different systems that weren't designed to support the kind of psychological resilience that extreme winter survival required. Modern research on survival psychology shows us that the mental frameworks people use to understand and cope with extreme challenges are just as important as their technical survival skills. The Vikings had developed incredibly sophisticated psychological approaches to extreme survival that helped them maintain hope, motivation, and social cohesion during conditions that would break most people mentally. The loss of these psychological frameworks was just as devastating as the loss of their technical knowledge. The social structures that had supported Viking winter survival were also unique in human history. The combination of individual responsibility and collective cooperation that characterized Viking communities created social systems that were perfectly adapted to extreme survival situations. These systems balanced the need for individual initiative and capability with the requirement for community cooperation and resource sharing in ways that maximized both individual and collective survival chances. The loss of these social structures eliminated organizational approaches that might have been valuable for many other human challenges. The Viking model of combining individual capability with collective responsibility could have been applicable to many other situations where human communities need to function effectively under extreme pressure. But these organizational innovations were lost, along with the survival knowledge that had made them necessary. The educational systems that had transmitted Viking winter survival knowledge were also remarkably sophisticated and effective. The combination of formal instruction, practical apprenticeship, and cultural transmission that characterized Viking education created learning systems that could preserve and transfer incredibly complex knowledge across generations. These educational approaches were perfectly adapted to the challenge of maintaining specialized survival knowledge in small, isolated communities. The loss of these educational systems eliminated teaching approaches that might have been valuable for many other types of specialized knowledge. The Viking model of combining practical experience with cultural transmission could have been applicable to many other situations where communities need to preserve and transfer complex technical knowledge. But these educational innovations were lost along with the survival knowledge that had made them necessary. The economic systems that had supported Viking winter survival were also unique and remarkably effective. The combination of individual ownership and collective resource management that characterized Viking communities created economic systems that were perfectly adapted to extreme survival situations. These systems balanced the need for individual incentives and responsibility with the requirement for collective resource sharing and risk management in ways that maximized both individual and collective survival chances. The loss of these economic systems eliminated approaches to resource management that might have been valuable for many other human challenges. The Viking model of combining individual ownership with collective risk management could have been applicable to many other situations where human communities need to manage scarce resources effectively under extreme pressure. But these economic innovations were lost, along with the survival knowledge that had made them necessary. The technological innovations that had supported Viking winter survival were also remarkably sophisticated and effective. The combination of simple tools and complex systems that characterized Viking technology created technological approaches that were perfectly adapted to extreme survival situations. These approaches balanced the need for reliability and maintainability with the requirement for effectiveness and efficiency in ways that maximized both individual and collective survival chances. The loss of these technological approaches eliminated innovations that might have been valuable for many other human challenges. The Viking model of combining simple, reliable tools with complex integrated systems could have been applicable to many other situations where human communities need to create effective technology under resource constraints. But these technological innovations were lost along with the survival knowledge that had made them necessary. The integration of all these different systems, social, cultural, educational, economic, and technological, into comprehensive survival approaches was perhaps the most impressive aspect of Viking winter survival capabilities. The Vikings had developed incredibly sophisticated approaches to systems integration that allowed them to coordinate multiple complex systems effectively under extreme pressure. These integration capabilities were just as important as any individual survival technique. The loss of these integration capabilities eliminated approaches to complex problem solving that might have been valuable for many other human challenges. The Viking model of integrating multiple complex systems into comprehensive solutions could have been applicable to many other situations where human communities need to coordinate multiple resources and capabilities effectively under extreme pressure. But these integration innovations were lost along with the survival knowledge that had made them necessary. The ultimate tragedy of losing Viking winter survival capabilities is that they represented some of the most sophisticated approaches to extreme environment survival that humans had ever developed. These weren't primitive techniques that were superseded by better approaches. They were incredibly advanced systems that were perfectly adapted to their specific challenges. The loss of these capabilities eliminated human knowledge and capabilities that might have been crucial for future survival challenges. The relevance of this lost knowledge becomes even more apparent when we consider the environmental challenges that modern humans are beginning to face. Climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation are creating conditions that require exactly the kind of sophisticated survival knowledge that Vikings had developed. The social systems, technological approaches, and psychological frameworks that had sustained Viking communities through impossible challenges might be incredibly valuable for modern communities facing new environmental threats. The loss of Viking winter survival knowledge also eliminated examples of human adaptability that might have been inspiring and instructive for modern people facing their own survival challenges. The Vikings proved that humans are capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that seem impossible, and they demonstrated that these capabilities can be developed and maintained through appropriate social and cultural systems. The loss of these examples eliminates proof that human adaptation to extreme challenges is possible. But perhaps the most important lesson from the loss of Viking winter survival capabilities is that human survival achievements are far more fragile than they appear. The systems that support survival capabilities can be lost with shocking rapidity when the social and cultural conditions that maintain them are disrupted. The preservation of survival capabilities requires constant attention to the social and cultural systems that support them. And these systems can be eliminated by forces that seem completely unrelated to survival challenges. Understanding this fragility is crucial for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation, because it reveals that survival capabilities aren't just technical achievements that can be preserved in libraries or museums. They depend on living social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and adapted to changing circumstances. The loss of these systems represents not just the end of particular survival techniques, but the elimination of entire ways of understanding and responding to environmental challenges. The story of Viking winter survival and its ultimate loss serves as both inspiration and warning for modern humans facing their own environmental challenges. It demonstrates that humans are capable of incredible adaptation and survival under impossible conditions. But it also shows that these capabilities depend on social and cultural systems that are far more fragile than most people realize. The preservation of survival capabilities requires not just technical knowledge, but the maintenance of the social, cultural, and organizational systems that make the implementation of this knowledge possible. The Vikings achieved legendary survival capabilities through the development of incredibly sophisticated systems that were perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. When those circumstances changed, the systems that had made their achievements possible were no longer viable, and the capabilities that had sustained them for generations were lost forever. This story reminds us that survival achievements aren't just individual accomplishments, but depend on complex social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and protected. The implications of this story extend far beyond historical interest. As modern humans face new environmental challenges and consider expansion into extreme environments, the lessons from Viking winter survival become increasingly relevant. They remind us that survival in extreme environments requires more than just individual capability or technological innovation. It requires the development and maintenance of complex social systems that can support survival efforts across generations. The loss of Viking winter survival capabilities represents one of the great tragedies of human history, not just because of the communities that died, but because of the knowledge and capabilities that were lost forever. These capabilities represented centuries of accumulated human experience and innovation in extreme environment survival, and their loss eliminated resources that might have been crucial for future human survival and adaptation. The story of Viking winter survival ultimately demonstrates both the incredible potential of human adaptation and the fragility of the social systems that make this adaptation possible. It shows us that humans are capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that seem impossible. But it also reminds us that these capabilities depend on social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and protected. The preservation of survival capabilities requires constant attention to the social and cultural conditions that support them, and the loss of these systems can eliminate survival capabilities with devastating speed. As we face our own environmental challenges and consider our own survival capabilities, the story of Viking winter survival serves as both inspiration and warning. It inspires us with proof that human adaptation to extreme challenges is possible, but it warns us that the social and cultural systems that support these capabilities are far more fragile than we might realize.